I generally agree what you're saying, David. I just add to it that there's actually room for a transatlantic dialogue on these issues because, as you point out, the situation in Europe and the situation in the United States in terms of political deadlock is very, very similar. And we have difficulties addressing the crisis as a result. And it's not only, I mean, a lot of talk is about the Tea Party movement and how that's going to shape US politics, but we have similar tendencies here in various European countries as well. And exchanging these views is, I think, very important. But what I wanted to do, John, if you allow me, is just to address two small points that relate to the other theme of this discussion, which is the global governance issue. We've been talking a lot about economics, and it ties into what you've been saying, David, as well, with regards to the smallpox and rapid response. We've talked a little bit about it in the first session, but what is rapid response on a multilateral global governance level? To me, it's not the institutions that we have today. It's actually finding more ad hoc, flexible arrangements, meeting of the minds of like-minded countries going through similar challenges and addressing them, and then putting something out there and hoping that other countries join in. Rapid response at a multilateral level isn't necessarily working through the WTO to fix the Doha trade agreement. It's perhaps even relying on ASEAN to come up with a deal on Southeast Asian trade, which then has a spillover effect on the global trade level. Or is it sensible to expect that the United Nations is able to negotiate a follow-on to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, whereas you actually only need a couple of states that are the primary stakeholders to reach an agreement, rather than to have the 200 plus members of the United Nations. Mm-hmm. In other words, I think what we need to move towards with respect to making global governance work, especially in this period of crisis, is these more flexible arrangements. And finding them will be one of the major challenges. And that's the second point I want to raise up, and it also ties to what's been said previously on this panel, that you cannot look at one single issue and stovepipe it and then disregard the interconnectedness that issue has with respect to the political, the economics, or the development aid, or the domestic political agenda. This is exactly also the reason why we're having this broad discussion, because all these issues are connected. And this is where I'd also throw up an idea. Is it useful to have a new sort of transatlantic discussion or a transatlantic forum on all these issues that we're talking about, not necessarily going through the G7 or the G8, however effective that was, or NATO, which is primarily still a military organization, or the EU-US relationship, which is still primarily a trade negotiating environment. Is there, what will it take at the transatlantic level to make this system work and to deal with these different issues all at the same time? Mm-hmm. Because otherwise you're stovepiping and missing the bigger picture.
Erik and then Klaus.
Rem, I think what you're describing is a very important process that a French sociologist called Michel Crozier analyzed when he looked at the stalled society that was France in the early 1970s. This was before we had our last big global governance debate, a global governance debate that extended all the way down into domestic politics, because remember the 70s was a pretty traumatic period as well. And the process is one where you start by establishing a little convention, then you spread this convention around until it becomes a norm, and then you formalize it into a rule. Now, this works for rulemaking, and I think you're absolutely right. We could have a little transatlantic agreement and then build on that, institutionalize that, and then have that become the global marker. But what we find in all of these situations is that the unintended consequences of the rule tend to undermine the stability of the system as a whole. And so this ad hoc, let's have another conversation at the transatlantic level, starts the ball rolling, but it doesn't ensure the stability of the regime at the end of the day. And it's that end of the day stability that we're suffering from, right? Let's not forget, the economic and monetary union that we have in Europe right now is a direct consequence of the shortcomings of the Bretton Woods system that we built in 1945. So if you want to complain about EMU, you might as well complain about that too. And we need to figure out ways to deal with these unintended consequences. And this is where we get back to your point, John. I mean, the problem is that even very sensible rules can be used against you, like the cloture rule in the Senate. A very sensible rule for allowing us to shut off discussion and proceed with legislation has now been converted into a rule that allows a minority of senators to drive the legislative agenda for the second legislative body in the United States as a whole.
To block, yeah.
And we can't get around that. And the fact that they actually used the cloture rule in the last round of budget negotiations, the one that just finished, is horrifying, because it means now we need a supermajority to do anything in the United States.
That's right.
The unintended consequence of the rule needs to be managed. And so I agree with your suggestion, Rem, that it would be good for us to have a kind of an ad hoc meeting. But I'm concerned that this would only just push the can down the road a little bit further and wouldn't solve the problem we find ourselves in today.
Interesting. Klaus.
Well, I feel to some extent a little bit attracted by what Rem just said, that we should look for flexible ad hoc arrangements or coalitions of the willing, things like this. The question which came to my mind when you spoke, Rem, was how would be the impact on the transatlantic relationship? Would such a small group changing tomorrow to another small group be taken serious by the United States of America? Would they respect them as a partner, or would they fall back into the attitude of the Roman Empire, divide and rule? It could easily be the case, depending on the people over there at the helm. So I think if we did this, and possibly it is the answer to the present situation, then we have to think at the same time about arrangements which are a little bit more firm in the European-American cooperation. When we wrote a pamphlet 3 years ago on a future NATO strategy, we suggested at the end that it might be a possible idea to establish something like a triumvirate of the United States, of the European Union, and of NATO, which sort out the issues, of course only the figureheads of those organizations, which sort out the issues and then put it to the vote of the participating nations. Perhaps we have to think about something like this in order to compensate for the shortcomings of flexibility and ad hocery.